We're in this magnificent hall at the RSA, and the RSA, of course, is one of the fruits of the 18th century Enlightenment. These are dark times, and there is a sense that Enlightenment values are under attack or in retreat.
It is true. I mean, where we are right now, one forgets, but one should not forget, in my opinion, because memory is so important, especially when things are changing so fast. A place like this that has been a hub for freedom of speech, for ideas, for exchange of ideas, culture, intellect, I think is incredibly important. And in many parts of the world, we see a regression, if you will. And I think it's very important to understand that this is not only happening in the East, in the Middle East, in some parts of the world that were until recently regarded as turbulent countries, wobbly countries. But there was this perception that the rest of the world, mostly the Western world, was more safe, stable, more solid, and in a way beyond that stage, beyond that historical turbulence. But now we know that we're all living in liquid times. Now we know that we can go backwards very fast. In some countries, that decline is much faster. It's much more visible, such as Turkey, where I come from. But my point is, what happened in Turkey can happen in other parts of the world. And so we have to see the similarities. We have to see what is at stake. And that is why I believe this is a very important time for global solidarity, global sisterhood, global feminism, global activism. People who were perhaps not really engaged in politics might find themselves more and more involved and responding to what's happening in the world today.
Of course, the Enlightenment was, among other things, the birth of something we call the public sphere, and it follows from what you're saying that actually what we've lost is any notion of the public sphere.
To me, it's always interesting how different societies regard the public space. All across the Middle East, the public space is a very patriarchal domain. We need to talk about this. City after city, country after country, we see women being pushed back into the private space. When you travel across the Middle East, you will see that streets belong to men, public squares belong to men, lots of the public discussions belong to men. So one of the central questions for me, concerns, is how to bring more women into the public space, how to create more diversity in the public space, but also how to hopefully enable or facilitate people to communicate across different political divisions. Because that's the first thing we forget. We might vote for different political parties, we might have different political views, but there are lots of other things we still share. What are those shared values around humanism, around democracy, around core central values that you can still bring people together? So what I observe in countries like Turkey, because those political divisions are so deep, women from different backgrounds are not able to come together, even around core values that should concern all of them equally.
It seems to me one of the things you're saying is that politics is always, in one way or another, a struggle over historical memory. Yeah. And that's true of the Brexit vote, which you could see as the final spasm of post-colonial melancholia in this country. We've seen really quite violent tussles over the meaning of the American Civil War. That question hasn't even been settled yet. These struggles over historical memory are absolutely central to what you're talking about, and they're a central part of your fiction, aren't they?
And in many ways, in fact, 19th century is not over. We're still living, especially when you go to the Middle East, you see this, but not only in that region of the world, in many parts of the world, questions about memory. How do we choose to remember, collective memory, but also how do we choose to forget? I think these are political matters. I thought about this maybe more carefully when I was writing The Bastard of Istanbul, because that is a book that focuses on the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian family, Armenian-American family. And what I have observed, especially in third-generation Armenians, was how powerful their memory is. I have met many young Armenians who carry the memories of their grandfathers, of their grandmothers. Whereas for a young Turkish student of the same age, it's more forgetting. It's more about forgetting. We are a society of collective amnesia in Turkey. And I think that creates lots of problems because you cannot come to terms with the mistakes you have made, with the dark pages in your history, as well as the bright sides, if you cannot have a memory. And again, in this book, as I was comparing Oxford and Istanbul, that was another thing in my mind, because when you walk into the Bodleian Library in Oxford, at Oxford University, to me it's amazing to see this sign, this placard on the wall with the names of the patrons who supported the library throughout the centuries. Now, those centuries were not easy centuries for British history. Lots of things happened throughout that time. But what is interesting for me to see is the continuity of support for the library. I say this as a joke, but it's also very true. Had we had such a library in Istanbul in the 12th century, 13th century, today that place would not be a library, would have changed names so many times, and would probably have been turned into a shopping mall, you know? So why do we erase the past? Why do we think modernity is constantly erasing the past with no sense of memory? And if a society keeps doing that, can you ever become more mature? So these are questions that really concern me, collective memory and also collective forgetting.